afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. How's everyone this afternoon? Oh, fantastic. Okay, so now it has been a conference of insightful discussions and conversations for everyone so far. And I believe that many of you have done lots of sharing as well as networking and lots of give and take in terms of information and knowledge has been taking place amongst all of you. So well done to everyone so far, all right? And I'm also sure you're all geared up and ready to move on further into the events of this conference this afternoon after a hearty lunch. Did you enjoy your lunch? Thank you very much. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, moving along, I would like to welcome all of you to our first keynote session of the NCCBA Conference 2023. And please allow me to introduce to all of you our esteemed keynote speaker, Dr. Carolyn Westbrook. Doctor, how are you this afternoon?
Thank you very much for the invite. I'm very well, thank you, Mindy.
Yes.
It's a great pleasure and a great honor to be here. So thank you for the invite, and thank you also to the British Council in Malaysia for helping me to get here.
Thank you. Thank you. We are so honored to have you here this afternoon, Doctor. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me just present a brief introduction of our speaker today, Dr. Carolyn Westbrook. Dr. Westbrook is a test development researcher at the Assessment Research Group British Council. She has worked on a number of testing and assessment development projects and provided language assessment literacy training for teachers around the world. So we have an expert with us this afternoon. Teachers, you can ask whatever you want to ask regarding teaching and training. Formerly an associate professor in EFL, Dr. Carolyn Westbrook is a senior fellow of the UK Higher Education Academy and has worked as a teacher. So we have a teacher amongst us today, a teacher trainer. So we have a teacher trainer with us today, and also materials writer. So that will allow us to ask lots of questions on learning material adaptations, yeah? Over the past 30 years, she's done all these things. Dr. Carolyn Westbrook has a wide range of experience teaching and assessing general English, business English, EAP, and ESP. Dr. Carolyn will be delivering a very captivating topic, ladies and gentlemen, this afternoon titled, Implementing Formative Assessment, a Scary New World. Yeah, assessment. The moment we hear the word assessment, some of us get the jitters. Ladies and gentlemen, are assessments really scary? Or are they just a very creative way, a very relevant way to view assessment from a very objective lens? What exactly is involved when we say we are implementing formative assessment in our classrooms? Ladies and gentlemen, let's together hear the views of our keynote speaker, Dr. Carolyn Westbrook. Doctor, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Mindy. Okay, I'm going to stand up because I move around a lot. I can't stay still. Again, I'd like to say a huge thank you to Mindy and to the ELTC, and particularly to Dr. Vanita for the invitation. And again, thank you very much to the British Council in Kuala Lumpur, particularly to Chen Yong and Sean Smith for helping me to get here and making sure that we were all good to go. Okay, so you've all had lunch, you're all sleepy, so I'm afraid this is going to be a slightly different keynote speech because I need you to help me. I need you to work with me. Okay, I'm going to be giving you some activities to do. Are you willing to help me? Say yes, Carolyn, or no, Carolyn? Yes, Carolyn? All right, that's good. That's a good start. Let's get going. So, implementing formative assessment. Is it a scary new world? We'll see. So, I'm going to start off just by introducing very briefly where assessment fits into teaching. I'm going to introduce to you the comprehensive learning system by my boss, Barry O'Sullivan, from 2020, and the curriculum design process that, as I see it personally. We're going to then look at the characteristics of summative and formative assessments. So as I understand it, you're very, very familiar with summative assessments, but maybe a little bit unhappy about formative assessment, or maybe not. We'll see by the end of the presentation if your fears are unfounded or if they are founded. So we'll distinguish between summative and formative assessments. We'll also look at what is the difference between informal and formal formative assessment, and how can we implement informal and formal formative assessment in the classroom, and then we'll talk about providing feedback for learning. Okay, so far? Yep, okay, let's move on then. So, has anybody heard of the comprehensive learning system? Just put your hands up if you've heard of it. No? One hand? Okay, so this is the comprehensive learning system. This is my boss, Barry O'Sullivan, and Barry likes shapes. So he has this triangle that he calls the old triangle. And if any of you are familiar with the Dubliners are an Irish band from decades ago, and they have a song called The Old Triangle. Barry is Irish, so he refers to this as his old triangle. But what he's talking about here is that curriculum, delivery, and assessment are inextricably linked. They must be inextricably linked together for any learning system to work. And what is important is that at the heart of that triangle, we have standards. The standards could be local standards, or they could be national or international standards like the CEFR. So building on that, this is how I see the curriculum design process. So in the middle of this, you've got the TLU domain. That's the target language use domain. So basically, how is the language used in the real world? And you can see that there are arrows everywhere. So the target language use domain feeds into everything that we do in the curriculum design process. If we start with the learning outcomes in the top right-hand corner, we've talked already quite a lot about learning outcomes. We need to think about who are our learners and why do they need the language? What should they be able to do by the end of the course? Now, as you can see, the arrows that go from there go either clockwise or anti-clockwise. So we'll follow it round clockwise first, and then I'll tell you why I think we can go anti-clockwise. So when we think about what the learners need to be able to do by the end of the course, we can then think about what content can we design. What content knowledge do learners need? What language do they need? What tasks can I design or provide to give them that knowledge or to elicit the knowledge required? Once I think about designing my content, I can also think about how I'm going to deliver that content. So you can see where the curriculum and the delivery are already linked. So how am I going to work with my students? Am I going to have them working individually? When am I going to get them to work in pairs? When are they going to be working in groups? When are they working in the classroom? What are they working outside of the classroom on? Will they work on the computer? We talked last night in the forum about using technology in our teaching. So will we have a flipped classroom approach? Will we ask students to do work on the computer or on online platforms outside of class? How are we going to do that? And then, importantly, how am I going to assess my students? Are they going to be assessed formatively, summatively, on a continuous assessment basis? And when will the assessments be? So then once I start to think about my assessment, I can start to think about what assessment tasks am I going to design? Is it going to be tests? Are they going to be assessments? Will there be a mixture? Are there any resources that I don't have access to? So do I have any restrictions on resources? What will learners actually need to do in their assessments? And crucially, will my assessments reflect the learning outcomes? So will my assessments measure and provide good evidence of whether my students have achieved those learning outcomes or not. So that's going round clockwise, but I think we can also sort of see it as an anti-clockwise circle where we start with the learning outcomes and we kind of reverse engineer from there. We say, to meet these learning outcomes, what do my students need to do as an assessment to demonstrate that they've learned it? From there, if that's what they need to demonstrate in their assessment, I need to think about how I can get them to that point. So what content and delivery methods do I use to get them to those assessments? So you can see, we can see it going both ways. Okay, happy with that so far? Alrighty, let's move on. So, little activity. I told you you can't fall asleep today. Sorry. Quite apart from the fact that you've got me talking in your ear for the next hour, you need to be involved as well. So I'm sure you're very familiar with all of these activities. So I'm going to ask you to help me here. I want you to put up the number of fingers where you think the key term belongs. So for example, if you think A, formative assessment, is number 4, I want you to put up 4 fingers. If you think it's 3, you put up 3 fingers. If you think it's 5, you put up 5 fingers. Okay? So we'll start with A, formative assessment. What number do you think it is? Okay, I've got some people going already. Yep, good, good. We're getting there. Got a few hands up. Yep. I appreciate you need a bit of time to read everything, so I'll give you a little bit longer on this one than on the others. Yeah, we're getting some hands up. Yeah. Basically, everybody that has got their hands up now is saying number 2, and you're correct. Yeah! All right, good job. All right, B, summative assessment. 5s, I heard a 4, I think. Correct, number 5. Woohoo, good job. C, checklist. Put your fingers up. 4s, 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 4s. It's very quiet over that far side, yeah. 4s, 4s. And indeed it is 4. Yes, well done. Okay, we'll speed up a little bit now because we've got fewer choices. Self-assessment. We've got 3s, 3s. We've got 1s, 3s, 3s. 3s. It is indeed 3. Well done. You're very good at this game. This is a nice, easy introduction. Okay, E, peer assessment. 6s, 6s. Yes, which means obviously the last one, feedback, is F. Good. Well done. Excellent. So we're all very clear on what these things mean. So let's move on. So summative assessment, we start with the learning outcomes. We do the instruction. We teach our students. There's an assessment. It could be at the end of the course or at the end of a period of learning. And as we spoke about yesterday, there's a grade and a decision. And there may or may not be feedback. There will be some feedback in terms of a grade, but there may or may not be some feedback that helps our students to learn. So what are the characteristics of summative assessment? Well, first of all, obviously, it produces a score or a grade. It comes at the end of a course or at the end of a period of learning. That may be the end of a course, it may be the end of a semester, it may be the end of a unit. It shows what the student has learnt. Often it's standardized, but not always. But crucially, it's used to make decisions about the student and their progress, and is used for accountability purposes for the school or the teacher. Okay? On the other hand, formative assessment isn't so much of a linear approach, it's more of a circular approach where we have our learning outcomes, which feed into our teaching, which feeds into our assessment, feeds into feedback, and crucially, our feedback feeds into the next learning outcomes. The characteristics of formative assessment are that it's flexible, it can be formal or it can be informal, and it can come at any time during a course. So I've already assessed you this afternoon several times. I assessed your motivation to see whether you were going to help me when I said, are you going to help me? Say yes, Carolyn, or no, Carolyn. I've assessed your motivation. I've assessed your knowledge already with the 2 fingers, the 3 fingers, and so on. So be aware, I could be assessing you at any time. Little devil's horns come out of my head. It involves different activities. It can be lots of different types of assessment, but crucially, it generates feedback, either for the teacher or for the student or both. And it's used to make decisions about teaching and learning. So not so much about the student's progress, but about teaching and learning. Where do I go next as a teacher to help you to move forward? What do I need to change in my teaching, or what do I need to go over again? So these are crucial characteristics of formative assessment. So, back to you guys again. Now, in your packs that you got yesterday, in your little Aptis bag, you got a folder and you got some colored paper. You had some pink paper, some orange paper, and some green paper. Could you take out your pieces of paper, please? So 1 pink, 1 orange, and 1 green. Well done. I can see lots of people getting colored paper out. This is good. Excellent. Well done. Okay, so another little quiz. I told you I'll be assessing you at any time. What I'm going to do, while you're just getting your pieces of paper out, I'll explain the situation. I'm going to give you some tasks. They are assessment tasks, and I want you to decide for each one if it's a formative assessment, a summative assessment, or if it can be both, maybe. If you think it is predominantly formative, you hold up your pink piece. If you think it's predominantly summative, you hold up your orange piece. If you're convinced it can be both formative and summative, you hold up your green one. But if you think it's probably formative or summative, but could also be both, you hold up, for example, the pink and the green, if you think it's formative or both. If you think it's summative or both, you hold up orange and green, okay? So I'll just show you the tasks, so that'll give you a few seconds to think about them, and then I'll start asking you to hold up your piece of paper. So the first one you can see there is a role play between 2 friends deciding which film to watch at the cinema, then listening to an audio text and answering questions under time-constrained conditions, reading a text and answering some questions under time-constrained conditions, taking notes on a lecture, doing some research on the internet and writing a draft of an essay about the benefits and drawbacks of electric vehicles, and giving a presentation about your favorite hobby. Okay, so these are not always traditional sit-down pen and paper tasks or tests, but they're different kinds of tasks that we might use in the classroom. So, the first one then, role play between 2 friends deciding which film to watch at the cinema. Hold up your pieces of paper. Okay, we have predominantly pink. Did I see any other colors? No, we all think it's pink. It's actually both. I can use it as a formative assessment, so it would be pink, but I can also use it as a summative assessment, so it's definitely both. And that wasn't a trick question, by the way. Okay, let's have a look at the next one. Listening to an audio text and answering questions under time-constrained conditions. So we've got pinks and oranges, we've got some greens, so some people saying both, we've got some oranges, we've got some pinks, got a few greens, so predominantly more likely to be summative. Well done. But it could be both. It could be both because I might use it for formative purposes. I might want to give my students give them a sort of practice test and then give some feedback to help them to improve for the real test. So it could be both. Reading a text and answering some questions under time-constrained conditions. We've got some greens, we've got some oranges, we've got some pinks and oranges, so both. Some greens and oranges. Yay! Excellent. All right, summative or both. So again, more likely to be summative, but I may use it as a formative assessment to prepare my students. Taking notes on a lecture. I've got some pinks, I've got some oranges, I've got some greens. Okay. Probably formative, but could be both. Well done. So those of you that got both colors, well done. So probably taking notes on a lecture is predominantly formative because it's very difficult to assess notes because people take notes in different ways. I write pages and pages and pages and pages and pages. My line manager, nothing. Nada. I can ask him about something that happened months ago and he will tell me exactly what happened in that lecture or in that presentation. The guy's a genius, but I have to write copious notes. Other people are sensible and can write proper notes, but I have to write lots. So it's very difficult to assess notes. So that's why we say it's predominantly formative, but it could be both. What about doing some research on the internet and writing a draft of an essay about the benefits and drawbacks of electric vehicles? Ooh, got a bit more of a mixture here. I've got some pinks and some greens and some oranges, some just green, some just pink. Ooh, quite a mixture going on here. Formative or both? Well done. So those of you that got pink and green, well done. Excellent job. Okay. Why? Because quite often when we're writing an essay draft, it's a formative task. We want our students to get some feedback to improve for the final draft. But sometimes we might assess that draft and call it a summative part of several different stages. So sometimes we might assess the plan, the essay plan. We might assess the essay draft. We will probably likely assess the final essay, but we might just give formative assessment feedback. And giving a presentation about your favorite hobby, last one. I've got a mixture going on, I've got some pinks, I've got some, we've got change of ideas here at the front. Pinks and greens, pinks, one or two oranges, some oranges, pinks and greens. Oh, this is exciting, isn't it? There's a whole range. Both. Because again, I can use it for formative feedback or I can use it as a summative task. So what does this tell us? What's the difference? The difference is what I do with the performance. If I give a score that contributes towards the student's final grade, it becomes a summative task. As soon as I give some feedback that will help my students to develop, it's a formative task. If I give my students a grade, but I also give them some feedback to help them perform better next time, it can be a summative task with a formative element. Okay? So they're not completely exclusive. As soon as there's any feedback involved, it has a formative element. But as soon as there's a grade involved that counts towards the decision for the end of year grade or whatever, then it has a summative element. Okay, moving on then. So we're going to focus today on formative assessment because this is what my talk is about. And we can see here that formative assessment can be divided into informal and formal assessment. So we're going to focus first of all on informal assessment, and that involves effective questioning. And effective questioning can be done in lots of different ways. And we'll have a look at these different ways in just a moment. Informal assessment can also be a test-teach-test approach. How many of you are familiar with the test-teach-test approach? Just put your hands up if you've heard of that. Okay, I'm testing you again. So this is your first test. So I'll go into teaching you about this in a moment. Or we might use self-assessment for formative assessment, and that will be rag cups. Does anybody know what I mean by rag cups? Red, amber and green cups. So again, I'll tell you about those in just a moment. So these are some ways of informally assessing formatively. So let's have a look at them. Hands up. So if I ask my student a question, ask my students a question, and they put their hands up to answer, who's going to put their hands up? The ones that know the answer. Who's not going to put their hands up? The ones that don't know the answer. So Dylan Williams, who is a very big figure in formative assessment, he says that we should stop students putting our hands up. We don't want students to put our hands up because what we're doing is invariably we pick the person who knows the answer, and quite often it's the same few students who always put their hands up. So what we're doing by selecting those and not selecting the others is we're widening that gap between the stronger students and the weaker students. So he says, no more hands up. End of discussion. But, of course, it does have its positive and negative aspects. On the one hand, I can choose to answer as a learner, but if I don't know the answer and you pick on me, there's a chance that I will lose face. I'll be embarrassed because all my friends around me are watching me and I don't know the answer, and that's embarrassing. So there's a chance that I can lose face. But if I choose to answer, there's no loss of face. So that's positive. But as I say, the negative is that it's often the same learners who are chosen, and this increases our performance gap. So a different way that he suggests is using lolly sticks, and what he suggests is that we have a number of lolly sticks. Each student has a lolly stick with their name on, and it goes into a tub, like you can see here with the teacher here, and we pull out a lolly stick at random and we ask that student for the answer. So this is good because everybody has an equal opportunity to answer. If I pull out one lolly stick, I put that down. The next question I'll pull out another student, the next time I'll pull out another student. And it's not always the same students answering. So that's positive. But the negative of that is that it may put learners on the spot and it may embarrass them if they don't know the answer. On the other hand, those stronger students who do know the answer are sitting there going, come on, can we get on with it? I'm bored. Let's move it along. So it can have positives and negatives, but it's worth trying out in your class and getting your students' reactions. Come on. I think my thingy has died here. Hang on, let me see if I can, no, my thingy has died. Maybe I switched it off by accident. That's very possible. No, I've definitely died. My clicker has died and gone to heaven, I'm afraid. There will be a short pause in proceedings. Okay. All right, so it's not just me. So if we could move on. Can we move on a couple of slides, please? Yeah, great, excellent. So another option is to have a tablet or a reusable whiteboard. And in this case, all the students have a reusable whiteboard where they can write the answer. So in the same way as I asked you to hold up your pieces of paper and I can see who has the correct answer, we can do this with a whiteboard or we can do it with a piece of paper and an eraser. Obviously, the negative if you're using tablets and whiteboards is that it needs an investment in the materials, but it does have the advantage that the teacher can immediately see who has got things right or wrong. Lovely, thank you much. Thank you very much to my colleague from the British Council, Sam, for having a replacement zapper. Okay, and then the other option is what we did before with the 2 fingers, 3 fingers, and so on. Again, I can see easily who has answered and who has got the question right, but I can only have a maximum of 10 questions because I've only got 10 fingers, unless I'm going to have brilliant students who can then put up one toe or two toes and I can go up to 20 questions, but unlikely. What we might also do, again, we talked about this last night, is we might use technology, and we can use things like Mentimeter, Kahoot, Padlet, all these different things, any number of different things like lino boards or sort of interactive whiteboards. And the positive here is that everyone can answer, and the teacher can get a clear view of group understanding. And also for the student, as the individual student, I have the advantage that if I get the question wrong, nobody knows it's me that's got it wrong. So I don't lose face again. But the negative, apart from the fact that sometimes these things need a subscription, is that some learners may not answer, and the teacher, crucially, doesn't know who got the question wrong. So I can correct the question, I can help the students, but I don't know which student it is that really needs my help. So these are all effective questioning tasks, or methods, if you like, but it's not just about the questioning. So I'm going to show you a short interaction here. Think about what the problem is with the implementation of the formative assessment approach used here. So the person is using lolly sticks for questioning. So the teacher says, who can tell me the answer question number 1, pulls out a lolly stick, picks on Joe. Joe, that's bizarre. Joe has got no E. So we were checking my presentation earlier on and we put an E on Joe in that first question and it's gone. Anyway, so Joe is asked, Joe says, I go to the shop yesterday. Teacher says, that's a good try, but it's not quite right. Let's try the next one. Picks another one. Martin. Martin says, I went to the shop yesterday. Teacher says, yes, well done. Now, question 2. Let's see who we can get to answer question 2. Okay? So it's questioning, it's using lolly sticks, but is it effective? Let's look at a slightly different version of the same conversation. Think about how the formative assessment approach here is slightly different. So the same beginning, who can tell me the answer to question 1? Joe pulls out, Joe is the person chosen. Joe, I go to the shop yesterday. The teacher here says, that's a good try, but it's not quite right. Can you tell me why it's not right? And Joe says, I'm not sure. It's past simple, and I think the past simple is with ED. So good justification. And the teacher says, that's okay. Let's see if one of your classmates can help, and pulls out another lolly stick. Martin, can you help? Martin says, I went to the shop yesterday. The teacher says, yes, well done. Can you tell us why we say went and not goed? Martin says, because to go is irregular, so the past simple is went. And the teacher says, that's correct. Joe, do you remember that we said that to go is irregular, so we need to learn that the past simple is went? Joe says, yes, I remember. So, same questions, basically, but 2 very different approaches to teaching and, crucially, to learning. The first one is that, in this case here, the student is given an opportunity to self-correct themselves. They're asked to justify their answer in the hope that they might be able to self-correct. They can't, they justify their answer, but they can't self-correct. So the teacher goes to a peer and asks the peer to correct. The peer manages to correct. If, however, the teacher had asked several peers and several peers couldn't help them, then they would offer the correction. So the difference here is that the teacher is the last resort, if you like. As the teacher, I don't want to be the one correcting my students. I want them to do it. And if they can't do it themselves, I want their friends to help. Only when their friends can't help do I come in. But also, I need justification of both incorrect and correct answers. I need students to explain why they got that answer. And that's particularly important if we're doing reading or listening comprehension, because we need them to say, I think this is the answer because I heard this part here, or I read this part here, and then we can say, well, yeah, you heard that part there, but if you look at the transcript, you'll see that the answer is up here and it's not this answer because blah, blah, blah. Similarly, if you're reading a text, you can show them where in the text the correct answer is and explain to them why they got it wrong. So it's really important that we have a justification of both the correct answers and the incorrect answers. And that as a teacher, we provide feedback about what is right and what is wrong if the other students can't provide that feedback. Okay, so far so clear? Yes? Okay. So test, teach, test. So I asked you if you knew what test, teach, test was, and only one or two of you put your hand up. So test, teach, test is where I ask students about something that I think they will have some idea of, but they're not going to know everything about it. So I might give them a task to do where they'll be able to do some of the task, but not everything. And I use that first test phase to see where the weaknesses are. Then I can fill in the problems. In the test phase, I teach them what they need to know, and then I give them another test, which is a similar task, and hopefully they can see that they've improved between the first test phase and the second test phase. So here's an example. So this is a very simple activity where learners are asked to fill in a form with personal information. So it's a very low level. So I first give the form to my learners. I get them to work in pairs. They fill in what they can do, what they can't do, they leave. I go around and moderate so I can see what they're doing right, what they're doing wrong. And then I have the teach phase where I give them the information. I teach them about vocabulary that they need. I might need to teach them in some cases about how to form the different letters. I might need to get them to copy different letters if they come from a different handwriting script. If it's Chinese or Japanese or Korean or Arabic, they might have problems just forming the letters. They might have written the letters back to front. So I give them the information that they need. I teach them, and then I test them by giving them a slightly different form to complete. Okay, so the advantage of this is that it can save me time because I only need to focus on where the students have weaknesses. I don't need to go over everything if they already know some things. So I can focus on the weaknesses. But if I ask them something right at the beginning that's too challenging for them, then it can be discouraging. Moving on to self-assessment, we talked about red, amber, and green cups. Here, each student gets a red cup, an amber cup, and a green cup. And when I give them a task, they select which cup reflects their ability to do the task. So if I'm perfectly happy with the task, I select my green cup. If I'm not sure, I put the yellow cup on top. If I really have no clue what I'm doing and I really desperately need some help, I put the red cup on top. And you've got a link to a video there. So some of these things that I've talked about are in a classroom assessment done by Dylan William. And this is the video. And you'll see Dylan talking to a group of students where he explains different things about what you can do. And then you'll see the teachers using those approaches in the classroom, and you'll also see some of the student reactions to that. And so this is one of the experiments that's in there. Now, the positive of these is that it promotes self-awareness for the student. The student has to recognize for themselves whether they can do the task or not. But apart from having to buy the cups, which needs a little investment, some learners might be too embarrassed to put up the red cups. So we need to tell learners to be honest with themselves so that if they need to show the red cup, I can help them out more quickly than if they show the amber cup. So it's about students being honest with themselves. So that's basically everything about informal formative assessment. Let's move now to formal formative assessment. We can still have self and peer assessment here. We might use Likert scales or smiley scales, or we might use checklists. We can do individual formative assessment tasks, and we can do group tasks. And we'll have a look at some of those individual and group tasks in a moment. So, self and peer assessment. Let's think about Likert scales. So this is an example of an objectives review. So at the end of a unit, the teacher gives them a Likert scale, or it might be a scale with smileys, where it's a big smile, a straight smile and an upside down sad smile, and the student fills in for themselves how well they think they can do these different things. So if we think about our learning outcomes, they say, can I do this well, not so well, or kind of okay-ish? Again, this promotes self-awareness, but again, some learners may not be able to determine accurately how well they can do things, or they might write what they think the teacher wants to see. So they might put nice big happy smileys because that's what the teacher wants to see. So we need to make it clear to them that it's not for me as the teacher, it's for them, so that they know what they need to go over or what they need to work on, and then they can come to me as the teacher and say, I need more help with this. So again, it's about students being honest with themselves. In terms of self and peer assessment, though, we can get them to assess their work themselves or assess their friends' work, but we must provide them with a checklist. I can't just say, have a look at your friend's work and correct it. What do I correct? What am I supposed to be looking at? I need to give my students a task checklist or a language checklist that says, have a look at this specifically and say, has your friend done it, yes or no? Or have you done it, yes or no? So again, this encourages autonomous learning and self-awareness, and this is the good bit, it saves us time. And that's always a good thing with a class of 50 students, right? Or 100 students. We can't correct 100 essays. So what we can do is we can get students to self-assess and peer assess and then rework their task based on the feedback that they've got from this task checklist or from the language checklist, and then we can look at it, and hopefully then we've got a lot less to correct. But again, it may be challenging for weaker learners, so we do need to make sure that we train students on how to use these checklists. So with self and peer assessment, as we've seen, it's important to provide a checklist for evaluation. It's important to help students understand the criteria, and if we can, it's good to provide examples of performance so that they know what should the ideal performance look like. We then encourage them to reflect on their own performance and on their peers' performance, and based on that reflection, we ask them to improve their work. So familiarity with the rating criteria and the levels of performance are very important to help students learn. Because if I don't know what the ideal performance looks like, I don't know whether I've done a good job or not. So this is very important. So that's self and peer assessment. Let's move then on to individual and group tasks. So we said before that we can use different tasks. Some of them can be summative, some of them can be formative, or some of them can be both. So we've got a selection of individual tasks here. Some of them we saw earlier on, some of them are slightly new or slightly different, and a few examples of some group tasks. Now, when we do individual tasks and group tasks for formal formative assessment, we have two different approaches. And we'll look at those in a moment. With individual tasks, we need to be aware, though, that the positive is that we can give individualized feedback to promote learning to the individual. But working on their own might be less motivating for some individuals. On the other hand, working in a group helps learners to work together to help each other, but the negative of group tasks is that the stronger learners may dominate, so any mistakes that the teacher gives feedback on are the mistakes of the stronger learners and not the weaker ones. So the weaker ones, again, we may be increasing that gap between the stronger and the weaker, so we need to be careful of that. Or it may be that the weaker learners can learn from the stronger learners if the stronger learners bring them with them and explain along the way why they may be struggling. Or an alternative, which actually Sam and I work on at the British Council, is that we have learners working together in sort of the planning phase of an assessment, but then they're assessed on their individual production. So they can do the planning, they can help each other to come up with ideas, but the actual production, whether that's spoken or written, is done individually, and the assessment is done individually, and therefore the feedback is done individually. And the way that we do it is kind of a task-based approach. So they have an introduction to the topic and the task. They might see an example of what a good performance looks like. And then they set about doing the tasks themselves. In the task-based learning framework, though, we don't give them any language when we set them off on the task. We let them get as far as they can with the language that we have, and then they will kind of do a practice run. And then at that point, we can give reactive and proactive feedback. What do I mean by proactive and reactive feedback? Proactive feedback is the sort of information that I think my students will need. So if I'm asking them to, for example, do a presentation about a graph, so where they're presenting data from a graph, I might not expect them to know things like to skyrocket or to plummet. So these kinds of vocabulary that I don't expect them to learn, that's my proactive feedback. It's my planned feedback. But I might find that actually I expect them to know to fall gradually or to fall slightly, and then they start mixing up verbs and adverbs with nouns and adjectives. So my reactive feedback is that I go over that, so I react to the errors that come out. And then they have a chance to revise their work, produce their work, and then we can practice those errors that were coming out, and we can analyze the language. So that's a task-based approach. Or we might take the approach of we teach them something, so we go through a unit and then we give them assessment at the end. So here are 2 assessment tasks. One, you're going to write an article for your school's online magazine on the issue of climate change. Suggest some solutions. The other one, you're writing an essay on is the climate really changing? Give your opinion and use examples to support your arguments. Similar, right? But what knowledge do I need to have given to the learners before I can send them off to do these tasks? So Tribble, 1996, says that for a writing task, and this applies equally for a writing as also for a speaking task, he argues that they need knowledge of the language system, so lexis and vocabulary. I can't ask them to write an essay or write a magazine article about climate change if I haven't taught them anything about climate change. They need content knowledge, they need the ideas, so they have to have the ideas from somewhere. They need to know how writing works, so they need to know that they have to plan, they have to organize their ideas, they draft, and then they edit and redraft. And they have to know what the genre looks like, or what context they're writing in. But also, I would argue that they also need critical thinking skills as well. And again, this sort of, again, comes back to what we were talking about yesterday with the whole person approach. It's going beyond just the formal language, but it's having critical thinking skills that are transferable. So if I need to do some research on the internet for my essay, I need to know, or I need to be able to judge, is this a reliable source or is it not? I need to have critical thinking skills. I need to be able to critically analyze my own work and say, have I done a good job? Have I answered the question? Have I not? So I need critical thinking skills. And as I say, we need to teach them these things before we can send them off to do the task. Okay, so let's assume we've taught them all of those things and we're going to send them off to do the task. Are these tasks equally difficult? Well, let's have a look at them in detail. So number 1 is a problem solution task, and it's a magazine article. So these are the kinds of features that we would expect our learners to be able to produce from this information. They need to know the present simple, present perfect continuous, possibly. Certainly the past simple, first conditional, maybe second and third conditional, and they need the general conditional. They need hedging phrases, things like may, might, possibly. They obviously need vocabulary relating to climate change. They need functions such as describing, suggesting, possibly expressing opinions. They need content ideas, obviously. The register they need to be clear on, that's a formal register, so they need to be able to write in a formal register, and they need to know what a problem solution text would look like in a magazine article. That's a lot. So I have to be able to analyze the task that I'm giving my students before I give it to them and say, what does this task require them to do? And can they do it? Let's have a look at number 2. So number 2 is an essay task, and it's an opinion essay. So here they need the present continuous, present perfect simple, present perfect continuous, maybe past simple, maybe will future, maybe going to future. Hedging phrases and vocabulary related to climate change again, describing, expressing opinions, and justifying. Also, content, they need to know how the climate has changed or is changing. Again, the register is formal, but this time it's an opinion essay, so it's a different type of genre with different content. Now, if we compare those, we can see that they're very, very different. So the words in blue are the requirements for the first task, the words in black are the requirements for the second task, and if it's red, then they're required for both. So we can see that there is some overlap, but there are also quite a few differences. So then the question is, are they of equal difficulty? And the chances are that they're probably not. One is going to be more difficult. If we think about it, the first one is probably more difficult because we need to be teaching the students about the first conditional, possibly the second and third, and the general conditional. That's going to be more difficult than the present continuous and possibly the present perfect. So I need to think about, are my tasks equally difficult? But I also need to think, have I taught all of this? Crucially, if this is going to be a summative assessment, I definitely need to make sure that I've taught all of this and that the tasks are of equal difficulty from one year to the next. And possibly, again, we talked about this in the forum last night, what if I give my students a nice easy task and they do really well, and the teacher next door gives them a difficult task and they don't do very well? That's not really fair on the others, is it? Great for my students, brilliant. Not so good for the others. So we need to bear these things in mind. Anything else to think about? Of course. Marking criteria, how am I going to assess it? And this is useful for summative, but we'll see it's also useful for formative as well. How long do they have, and how long does the text have to be? I'm going to assess it, am I going to assess it holistically or analytically? If it's for formative assessment, it's best to do it analytically, because then we can look at different criteria. Can my students achieve the task in the time limit and in the word limit? If possible, do the task yourself. Ideally, ask a colleague to do it. Really, really ideally, ask your colleague to give it to their students and see if they can do it before you use it specifically as a summative assessment. Not so important for a formative, but certainly for a summative assessment, that's very difficult. And again, think about how the level of what you're teaching your students compares to the level of other students. Again, think back to our triangle with our circle. It's about having standards in the middle, so we still need those standards. And ideally, we want to keep the standards the same across different classes. So once we've got the students to do the task, we need to be able to rate it. We need to design a rating scale. And it's very important to have rating criteria to ensure consistency of marking, whether that's summative or formative. But for formative assessment, this is where we have our basis for feedback. So the rating scale is our basis for feedback. And when we design rating criteria, we need to clearly distinguish between levels. So we need to be very careful that we don't have just similar words that are at different levels, because we won't be able to distinguish. So what is the key to all of this? Well, if you haven't realized yet, the key to formative assessment is feedback. This is the crucial part of it. So let's have a look at that. So here's an assessment task. I've got a few minutes left, so I might have to run over a little bit, if that's all right. If not, you'll have to just tell me to shut up. So here's an assessment task with a student's performance. So I'm going to make it easier for you. I've corrected it for you. So based on this, think about what feedback you would give to the students. You don't have time to make notes, but just think about what important feedback would you give to your student that produces this? Okay. And then just hold the feedback in your head. So think about how you would feedback and hold it in your head. And we'll have a look at some different feedback types. So the traditional approach to feedback is the sandwich approach. So we say something positive, we say what they've done not so well in the middle, and then we end on something positive. And the student goes away feeling nice and happy because it's ended on a positive. But complete waste of time. Whatever you've been taught, complete waste of time, this feedback, because it doesn't tell the students how to improve. It tells them what they're good at, great. It tells them what they're not so good at, great. But how do I improve? So, Hill and McNamara refer to different types of feedback. They refer to person-referenced and task-referenced feedback. And person-referenced feedback is aimed at the student's ego. This makes the student feel all nice and warm and fuzzy inside. So, for example, well done. I did well. Yeah, good. Well done, me. But it doesn't help me to improve. Task-referenced, on the other hand, refers to performance or relates performance on the task to these standards and these requirements that we're talking about over and over again. In our triangle, our little circle, these are the standards. How did I compare to the standard that I'm aiming for? And within task-referenced feedback, we have confirmatory feedback, which tells the student whether they've done the task correctly or not. We have explanatory feedback, which explains what they did well. So, for example, I like the way you compared X and Y, then you explained why you preferred Y. That's useful. We also have corrective feedback, which highlights the gap between the actual performance and the expected performance. So, for example, you had a clear structure and introduction in the presentation, good. The content was well developed, good. But you finished abruptly. So here, we expect you not to finish abruptly. So we see what the gap is. Now, perhaps not surprisingly, only explanatory feedback and corrective feedback are useful. The others are not useful for learning. They might be useful to make the student feel good, but they're not useful for learning. But this still doesn't give us the whole picture. So what we refer to is feedback and feed forward. So the feedback we've already had. The feed forward is crucial. What do I need to do to improve next time? How do I close that gap? So next time, add in a summary of your main points and a conclusion. That will mean that you don't stop abruptly and will also be a good reminder of your main points for the audience. So this tells me what I missed out on. What do I need to do next time? But even that, for me, still missing something, and we'll have a look at that in a moment. So, going back to our little assessment, think about what type of feedback you would have given. Would it have been the sandwich approach? Would it have been confirmatory? Would it have been explanatory? Would it have been corrective? Would it have been person-referenced? Or would it have been feedback and feed forward? So, here's an example of some feedback and feed forward. Now, this is a long piece of feedback. So obviously, if you were giving this to your students at this lower level, you would want to give it to them in their L1. But what we can see here is we highlight, first of all, what the student did well. So you gave a full answer, you said where you went on the trip, but you also gave additional information about why you went on the trip and who you went with. Good, excellent. We tell them what they didn't do so well. However, you made a few errors with the irregular past tense forms, and you missed out spaces and commas after full stops. So that's what you didn't do so well. So what do you need to do next time? Next time, remember to leave a space after commas and full stops, and check your work, especially irregular past tense forms. Well, that's fine, but if I don't know the past tense forms, there's no point in me checking my work, is there? Because I don't know whether it's right or wrong. Like our friend Joe, who says it's good because it's past tense. That's not helpful to me. What I need to know is the next bit, how can I figure out where I went wrong? So an example of a task or an exercise that will enable that learner to close the gap, to learn that bit that they struggled with. So here, for example, it would be a good idea to revise irregular past tense forms. You could do the exercises here, and I send them off to learnenglishteens.com, where they can do an exercise online in their own time. They'll get the feedback automatically from the computer, and they'll get explanations of what went wrong if they got it wrong. Now, obviously, this is kind of drip feeding them a little bit, but we can, by giving them a few of these exercises where they get used to saying, oh, right, learnenglishthemes.com, that's got loads of exercises, and I saw I've got an error here now. I can go to Learn English Teens and I can find an exercise on it. So once we get used to giving them some way of finding out how to improve, we can maybe drop that last stage because, again, we want them to become autonomous. We want them to be able to find the answers themselves. But, you know, if I say to you, you need to improve how to write a conclusion, well, how do I do that? Well, there are probably textbooks out there, but I don't know which textbook to look at. So the teacher needs to say, have a look at this exercise in this textbook. It talks about how to write a conclusion. Or have a look at some articles and have a look at these features. So I need to be given some guidance to get me from where I am now to closing that gap. So just the feed forward on its own isn't enough. Feed forward plus an example of a sample of a task is what I need. So I can also do this with self or peer assessment. So here's an example of a checklist that I might give to my students for that task that we just looked at. So again, did you write 30 to 40 words? Did you check the tenses? Did you use the past simple correctly? Have you written about where you went? Have you written about when you went there? Have you written about what it was like? Have you checked the spelling and pronunciation? So all of these things are our success criteria. These are the things that we are judging the students' success on. So if they can have a look at these things themselves and ask themselves, did I do that, yes or no, they can hopefully close some of the gap already for themselves before we get it to mark and we have to cover it with red ink or green ink or whatever it is. So to summarize, you'll be glad to hear I'm finishing now. Formative assessment. Remember, many tasks can be both formative and summative. It's not just one or the other. They can have both impacts. The difference is simply whether the students are awarded a grade that counts towards their final grade, or whether we give them feedback that will help them to develop. Remember, though, that formative feedback can be informal and it can be formal. If it's informal, so things like fingers, our different pieces of paper, interactive whiteboards, all of these things, that's often for the teacher to collect data about the students, to inform teaching. It tells me what you know and don't know so that I can amend my teaching accordingly. Formal feedback is more likely to be for the student. It's collecting data for the student to improve. I might give that data to the student and I might tell them what they have to do to improve, but the feedback goes to them. It may also affect my teaching. So if I find, okay, out of 40 students, 30 of them have a problem with the past tense, then obviously I know I have to go over the past tense again. But if it's only one or two, I can say, okay, most of them have got it, I don't need to worry. So it can be formal and informal, and it collects data for the students and for the teachers. And effective questioning is important when we do informal feedback, but good quality feedback when we're doing the questioning is crucial. So good quality feedback is crucial throughout. As I say, the one thing that you take away from here is feedback is important. That's the only thing you learn from this. Feedback is key. In terms of self and peer assessment, as we've seen, we must provide learners with a checklist so they know what to assess themselves and their peers on. We need to ensure that learners have the knowledge that they need for an assessment, whether that's the language system, the content, how to write or how to plan speaking, what the genre looks like, and their critical thinking skills if appropriate. We also need to familiarize students with the rating criteria so that they know what standard they're aiming for. What does performance look like? So if we can have samples of performance, that's great. And we need to make sure that they can do what they need to do in the time and the word length. And specifically for summative assessment, but also just for fairness, we want to make sure that the tasks that we give our students in different groups are equally difficult. And then finally, effective feedback includes information about what the students have done well, what they've struggled with, what they need to do to improve, and crucially, what activities they could do to improve, or how they could set their own goals to improve. But again, that needs training. So, my presentation was called something along the lines of Implementing Formative Assessment, a Scary New World. So, this is up to you to think, is it a scary new world, or are you all sitting there going, I do that anyway. I don't get it. What's the problem? I do it anyway. If you're sitting there doing that, brilliant. Because it means that you're doing formative assessment already, and it's actually not a scary new world. Is it actually just good teaching? In my humble opinion, I have always said that formative assessment is just good teaching. Hopefully you agree, but feel free to disagree. That's fine too. But I would like to say thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for your participation. Thank you. And for anybody that can get some funding, we have the New Directions East Asia Conference coming up in Hanoi in Vietnam in October. And this is all about the future of English language assessment in learning systems. So we're right back at the start with our triangle and our circle. I don't know whether we've got time. I don't think we've got time for questions, have we? Do we have time for questions? I don't know.
Yeah, we'll be having a session on QA. Yeah, we will be.
Say again?
We'll be having a session on QA soon. Yes.
Okay, so we don't have time for questions.
We have.
Oh, we do have questions.
We do have.
Oh, right, we do have time for questions. So if you have any questions, fire away.
Yeah. Do you have any questions, ladies and gentlemen?
Or if you, not even questions, but if you want to say, I completely disagree with you, Carolyn, because, that's fine too. Any questions at all, or any comments?
Yes, okay, we have one. You may want to introduce yourself first.
Hello, good evening. I'm William.
Hi.
All right, I'm just going to share something that I used to do in my classroom. Okay, talking about effective answering, I mean putting up the hands. All right, as you said, only those who knew the answer will put up the hands, right? So I used to tell my students in my classroom, if I as a teacher ask you any question, all of you must put up your hands. Okay? The thing is, those who really know the answer, put up your right hands. Those who don't know the answer, put up your left hand. So whenever there are people observing my teaching, whenever people are coming to observe me as a teacher teaching in the classroom, when I ask you any question, the whole class, 42 of them will put up their hands. Okay? And it gives a very good impression on those observers, invigilators, that wow, this teacher is good. Whatever, any question he poses to the students, everyone is willing to answer. But only myself and the students know what is lying behind. Thank you.
This is great. I was just talking to somebody in the UK about this the other day. So in the UK, we have a system called Ofqual. And we have school inspectors that come in to inspect our teachers in the same way that you were talking. And they do the same thing. There are teachers in the UK that do the same thing. They say, right, the inspectors are coming. You have to look keen. You must put your hand up to answer the question. If you know the answer, put one hand up. If you don't know the answer, put the other hand up. But make sure you put your hand up. So that's a way around it, of course. But again, you know, it's interesting because then we might still pick on the people that know the answer. So we do just need to be aware. And maybe sometimes then pick on the ones that don't know the answer so that we can find out where the issues are. But yes, cheeky. Cheeky, sneaky, like it. Any other comments or questions? Okay, well, I'm around for the rest of the conference. If you think of anything or if you want to talk to me sort of out in the foyer or wherever, do feel free to come and get me. But thank you so much. I hope it was useful for you, even if you only go away going, yeah, I can do this. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Carolyn. I think that was a very informative session. Will all of you agree on that? Yes, very informative session and also very interactive. Yes.
Well done, you guys, for interacting.
Yeah. And I'm sure many questions have been answered on, is this formative? Is this summative? Am I moving to formative? When did formative become summative? Yeah, so many of these questions were cleared just now when Doctor shared with us on is this formative, summative, or is it both, the activity that you did, yeah, and the explanations and considerations when you're asking questions. So the next time, instead of just asking your students to put up their hands, there's so many other ways that you can use jolly sticks. I did some notes. Yeah. Can use jolly sticks, whiteboards, yeah, so many different ways of questioning. So can I ask you that big question, is formative assessment still scary? No? It should not be, yeah, because as mentioned by Dr. Formative assessment is all about good teaching. Yeah, so ladies and gentlemen, let's give a huge round of applause to Dr. Carolyn Westbrook for such an interesting session. Thank you so much. Over to our announcer.
Thank you, Dr. Kalminda Jitkor. Thank you, Dr. Carolyn. Next, I would like to invite Dr. Kalminda Jitkor to give away the certificate to our speaker.
Hello, I am Dr. Shamala Rajamani, and I'm very glad to be here in this conference. Basically, what is my expectation of this course is I expected something about assessment, how we assess students. Being a teacher for 28 years, it was good to know more about assessment and how it is done, formative, summative. And so I came here, but what I gained here is how to psychologically help students in feedback and in assessment, because in long term and in short term, this is our core business, right? So the interesting point about this is humanizing the assessment by making it realistic and thus making the teachers and students to develop personal relationship. In the process of learning and teaching, there is a development of relationship. So the future usage of this assessment, I would use different types of assessment to vary feedback and feed forward. There are two different matters here. So teaching and learning happens. I would like to say a big thank you to ELTC for this eye-opener. Thank you, ELTC.
Okay. Oh, all right. Yes. And then what do I do after I've